people started to get used to elevators. They were introduced consciously. The problem with elevators was people thought they were going to die in there. They didn't want to use the elevator, right? And so they did say, well, let's put some mirrors. We have them until today. Let's put some music. So people will be distracted with their own image. They will be soothed by classical music. But actually what was really interesting was they put in the person operating the elevator. Was it because operating the elevator was difficult? No, everyone knows how to push a button, right? It was because people thought, okay, if it's this guy's job to be here for 8 hours, he doesn't die every day, so it's safe. And I think it's the same with AI.
We talk a lot about AI assurance and insurance, testing models, managing bias, keeping systems fundamentally safe. But what about when AI fails or machines create unpredictable outcomes? These new non-deterministic systems will fail.
The insurance industry has always been the industry that enables the world to take on risk. 300 years ago, we had that fascinating idea that risk could be calculated and transferred to someone else, right? And so now people can engage in risky behavior because someone else is going to take that risk away from them.
Three-body problem looks a little bit like the UK's AI assurance roadmap. They're actually talking about something called the multiplayer accountability problem. It's that when you start to bring in systems that have the risk or a trading loss across so many variables that we can't even computationally analyze or predict, how do you even start to underwrite that level of complexity?
Baseline.
The baseline is designed to create an emotional response.
I've seen things you won't believe.
More human than human. Make you question everything.
Our guest that joins us today believes that insurance will be the missing piece that helps us live with this AI failure, just like we've done with cars, with aeroplanes, with elevators, and indeed cyber risk. We're joined by Magda Ramada Sarasola. Magda is the global InsurTech innovation leader at Willis Towers Watson. Magda's been at the forefront of emerging technologies like blockchain, risk transfer, and financial inclusion. And now she's asking, how do we insure AI agents and startups in the middle of this fast growth AI era?
I mean, I've been doing blockchain for a very long time, right? And I always find it very frustrating that we have not been able to prove the value of decentralization to everyone, to people, right? It's just like the killer app of decentralization has not really been found. What we have is like subpar copycats of things that, unless you're really providing something different or far better, far cheaper, people will still go for the centralized option, right? And so those ideas where you really are doing something you couldn't do before are very cool, like prediction markets or what you just described. So hopefully we'll get used more to that as a society, to that distributed infrastructure and ecosystem.
I thought decentralized architectures, blockchains, distributed ledgers, hashing, decentralized cryptography was just elegant and beautiful. And I tried to apply it to enterprise data, intercompany data sharing, and it was good. The problem was it was missing the incentive.
Yeah.
It was missing the incentive.
But, because centralization is a great thing to monetize. And so what I always say, I used to be a big fan of the Ethereum ecosystem. Now I'm sometimes I think, well, we should find a way of of finding its uniqueness, and to some extent it feels a lot more centralized than it was supposed to be when it started, right? But at the end of the day, Bitcoin ends up being like the one use case that has really proven to be something different, because it's a store of value that now can, help you with debasement and a lot of things, and it provides an alternative, right? But I always believe that decentralized apps and decentralized infrastructure would enable us to actually generate different economic systems. And that never took off, right? It has been 15 years, and and you look at it and you ask yourself why. One of the things is it's difficult to articulate the value of decentralization. And so people, it's like the Napster versus Spotify story. I mean, Napster wasn't necessarily legal from the way in which they were actually distributing, as a peer-to-peer platform, their music. But Spotify is highly centralized. It sells your data. It monetizes your music persona, right? But the practicity is there, and people don't care that they're being monetized, right? And that their data is being sold. And so it's a thing about the value of decentralization is very difficult to articulate. Mm-hmm. And if you look at the way in which it worked, you think, okay, there was a lot of ICOs and a lot of money was made with some of these coins at the beginning that got, valuations that actually generated money out of thin air, right? And that money has been invested into developing a decentralized infrastructure that no one had a proper investment incentive to develop. And so I think that's the interesting part of it, because that ecosystem, out of an idea, right, and sociological innovation, was able to generate wealth to develop an infrastructure when the traditional business environment had no incentive to generate it. But I think where we failed was we have tried to imitate things in a decentralized fashion, like decentralized Amazon, decentralized Spotify, decentralized. Instead of looking at, okay, this is what new technology should be about. What can we do today that we could not do in the past? We can do decentralized identity. We can do things that we couldn't do in the past, right? And that's where we should focus. We shouldn't focus on replicating what's out there, that it, has hundreds of years of generating trust. Yes, they're getting paid for that trust, but it's very difficult to unbank trust, right? So I think that's why we're not seeing the ecosystem really leaving the niche, except for Bitcoin, right? And yeah, I don't know if that's going to change. So if you had asked me 10 years ago, I would have said, this is, I actually was on stage saying this, right? It's a sociological innovation. It's going to change the way we distribute economic value. It's going to generate additional layers of economic activity. It hasn't really happened, right? There's a couple of use cases like prediction markets where we're doing things that we couldn't, or your example on the PhD platform. But other than that, even DeFi is just, I struggle sometimes to see if that's really what we're after.
A couple of points you made there resonate quite deeply. I still carry PTSD from 2016. What I tried to do when I was building this enterprise platform on blockchain was do exactly what you said was the mistake, was try to trivialize it by calling it a database.
Yeah.
Try to trivialize it by calling it a data sharing platform. And I did that because by talking about blockchain, people got confused about cryptocurrency, and we were using Hyperledger, so it was private rather than public. There weren't any to help people understand what it was, to try and create adoption, you trivialize the value.
That's so true.
And then by trivializing the value, well, we're up against Oracle, we're up against MongoDB, but why would we change?
Yeah.
So when I look back, I see the mistakes in such clarity.
Yes.
But I don't know what I would do differently now, because there has no real enterprise blockchain companies emerged.
Because, and I said this, we're out there actually explaining this. The whole idea of actually building decentralized infrastructure was that it was decentralized and owned in a decentralized fashion. And it was very difficult to monetize because it wasn't supposed to be monetized in the first place. So all of these enterprise and I built my own blockchain kind of things, right? They didn't make sense. They didn't make sense because why would you, it ceased to be, it went against the spirit of it. The principle was you cannot monetize it. So I remember being on a table with a lot of regulators and the initial ideas around Hyperledger, and then there was people from Ethereum, and so I'm not going to name people, but some very prominent people still in this space, and we were there, and you had all of these people saying, no, we're building a blockchain that's enterprise ready. And I was like, why on earth would you do that? I mean, there's no conflict of interest. I mean, if you want to monetize it, do it on a centralized basis where you have, more security. There's a number of things you can do better. And this was never about the data ledger, right? The data ledger was a consequence. It was about generating a trustless ecosystem to do transactions. So I wouldn't do anything different, right? When I look at the past, I think, I really believed almost like, it was this principle-driven ideological thing about decentralization is a good thing, and now we can build a decentralized world, right? And I still believe in that. I think the sociological component of the innovation of blockchain is still there, and it's amazing. And I've become more of a purist over time. But so I wouldn't change anything. I think when you have new technologies, a lot is about experimentation and understanding the art of the possible. And that presupposes that you will have duplication, people inventing the same thing, and that you will have value destruction, because a lot of people invent the wrong things, right? And I think that's part of the story of how innovation has to evolve. And we're seeing that with AI today as well. So I wouldn't change a thing. I'm still a very strong believer. It's just like, I don't think we have been necessarily building all of the right things. And some of the things that we thought were really going to deliver differential value, like self-sovereign IDs and decentralized identity vaults. I still believe that should be the future. But when you ask yourself, who has the advantage of actually building this? Who wants to build this? How do you get mass adoption, right? It's difficult. And then if you're thinking about governments doing it, then you'll ask yourself, okay, but how will they use the data? To which extent will enable it more control, less control? People get really confused about that. And so it's not easy. I think it's part of our evolution, as mankind in looking at how we deal with our data and our identity. And we have been able to isolate some cases that make sense. And perhaps with AI in combination, technologies are never in a vacuum.
Well, let me say, the number of AI startups are exploding in number.
Yes.
And I've seen a huge trend recently of almost an exodus of executives from large tech companies.
Yeah.
So seduced by AI, they have an idea, they're leaving the big tech companies to start their own thing.
Yeah.
Because you can synthesize an idea into a prototype with a brand instantaneously, essentially. But I do see a little bit of the same rush that I saw in the blockchain era.
Yes.
Where companies are over-promising, under-delivering. Large potential customers are having a look. They're kind of kicking the tires.
Yeah.
But actually the leap from an innovation project to production is huge at the moment. But PwC are reporting that AI is going to generate $16 trillion over the next 5 years.
Numbers, right? It's just like crazy how we generate them, yeah?
But that blockchain hype cycle, are you seeing the same in AI? Do you think we're in a bubble? Do you think there's a bit of a reset and then a growth again? How do you see it playing out?
So actually, I get this asked a lot. And my answer is, I don't think it's a bubble. I mean, there is a lot of activity in there that's not real AI, right? And so I think a lot of that will fail or will find its place. And a lot of people are trying to ride this wave, right? But if you look at, so there's like two things that make this a lot more tangible and real and probably will have a more significant impact in society, which is this has, it has mainstream adoption, which blockchain never really had, right? It has a usability and it delivers value to everyone, across generations, across countries, across socioeconomic strata, in a way that blockchain was never able to deliver. It has a clear path to monetization. And it is different from what we used to do before. So a lot of times when I get on stage and I talk about AI, right, I start saying, okay, what is AI and why, so many people are saying they're using AI, and what they're using is not AI. So look at the insurance industry, right? In the insurance industry, we have been predicting outcomes for a very long time. And we started using predictive analytics, and I would argue, it has become standard practice across insurance companies to use advanced analytics and predictive analytics since at least 2000, because, in the 90s that really picked up. And yeah, it was statistical methods. It has that statistical core set around it, right? But it was about predicting the future. Then we got into machine learning, which was, we're losing a bit that statistical core set around it, right? And you let the data and the patterns of the data explain a bit more and extract patterns from it. So you do that. And then we actually had AI for a while because, convolutional neural networks and recurrent neural networks and a lot of the things around deep learning models we've been using for image extraction. We've been using it for voice to text. So AI has been there for a while. Why does this now feel different, right? When you look at Gen AI and agentic systems. Well, first, because what transformers can do and their architecture and the way they operate as an algorithm is fundamentally different. They're able to generate content. They have transfer learning abilities. They have, few shot and zero shot learning abilities. There's a lot of things that none of the previous algorithms and systems we had was able to deliver. And they are true AI because AI is not about predicting. It is about imitating the way we think and acting like a human. That is what defines AI as AI, right? And obviously, when you're building AI systems, you have to understand how to forecast. Because to act as a human, we are making millions of decisions all the time. And all of them are based on, if I do this, this will happen, right? So you're constantly forecasting the impact of your actions. That's how we process information. That's how we act. And the systems that we have now and the transformer architecture behind large language models and generative AI, they are really generative. It's in the name. They're able to generate things that weren't there before, that you haven't taught them to do, right? And that is fundamentally different. So for all of those reasons, I think that we really are at a point where we have a technology that can deliver things that we could not do in the past. And that will accelerate how other technologies are able to help us.
The AI, as you're talking about this emergence of the AI agent, and agentic AI, there's two things that are becoming quite apparent to me. The large language models we have and the applications of those in conversational AI are non-deterministic.
Yep.
They are slightly unpredictable, more human-like than traditional mathematical, algorithmic-based enterprise infrastructure or those sort of things. So if what we're saying is that on a spectrum of behavior, we are accepting that machines or AI agents are going to be acting slightly more human. And how much human is going to be based on how tight the context is, the weightings within the LLMs. There's a whole load of data science that goes into that. But we are accepting there's going to be unpredictability within the AI agent. If that's the case, and we're accepting that AI agents are moving from just speaking to us to actually doing things on our behalf, we're entering a world where there could be risk. There could be risk. So those two elements.
There is risk, right?
So this is where I'm really interested to understand how insurance is going to play to the emergence of 2 billion AI agents operating on behalf of people, banks, transportation companies, manufacturing companies.
Yeah.
This is going to be, I would say, one of the biggest opportunities for insurance that's ever been.
I fully agree with that. And then when you look at agents, right, in the name is the word agency, which means purpose and the ability to act, right, and to be autonomous. So until now we had like pseudo autonomy on things we were automating because they were rule based, and even if they had some stochastic element, it was within a model, and you knew exactly how that randomness would behave. That's not the case, right? And with LLMs and transformers, even if you're working on those value functions and self-attention functions and attention functions and restrict the temperature, it can never be zero. So that has two implications that are fascinating. The first one is, as humans, we're getting used to the fact that we're talking to machines and we're not sure what they're going to do. And so that is actually fascinating from a societal perspective, that we're getting comfortable with interacting with non-human things that are unpredictable and have an impact in our lives. And so in addition to that, it also has an impact on how we structure these systems to help us. So when I talk about agents, I always say, there's like 3 critical things around agentic AI and agents. And they're very similar to how you would treat an intern or your kids, right? So I like to make that analogy. So when you're interacting with a teenager, or you have interns or new people joining your company, the first thing you learn is how to communicate with them. They have different styles. They might be from a different generation. They might be from a different culture. They understand the world differently. So you have to learn how you communicate with them and how you pass on information and instructions for them to do their job. And I don't know, when I talk to my kids, usually, if my instructions are very long, they will forget half of what I said, right? So you learn to communicate with teenagers in a more structured way. You reinforce at the end. Lots of things that we have learned from a prompt engineering perspective have the same impact on agents. Agents it's crazy because of the way in which LLMs are built and the complexity behind the way they encode and decode information and learn to apprehend the world. They have personalities, right? They get tired. Perhaps you've had this conversation where it's like, this conversation is getting too long. I recommend starting a new conversation, because sometimes it's just like, it's too much for the agent to handle, right? Which could happen to someone that's starting a new job. So you learn how to communicate, but then you also have to contextualize them and say, you know what? In this company, these are our processes. These are the tools that you have to use. This is the way in which you will do this task, right? So providing access to those tools and that context really changes the way an agent is able to perform an activity. And then there is this whole thing about orchestration. And we have been doing a lot of experiments about how orchestration impacts performance and outcome, and how it can minimize some of those risks of the unpredictability of what you're building. And so if you know that, what you need to generate is the averages on a certain data set, then you won't ask it, it's expensive and less effective to ask an agent to say, oh, can you calculate these averages for me? Depending on the agent you have, it will go like for a virtual coffee, think, okay, what is an average? I'm going to learn about an average right now. And a lot of things that just, you know exactly what has to be done. It's a function, it's deterministic. And so you start orchestrating these systems where you have agents that have the freedom to think about things that need the complexity of human thinking, combined with deterministic functions, with deterministic processes, with straight automation, with humans in the loop. And that orchestration is key. And the thing about orchestration is it's really difficult to map the impact. So you're experimenting, and then you say, okay, I'm going to do a hierarchical system, or I'm going to do, swarm dynamics. And so there's a lot of research going into what is the most effective way to orchestrate. But the dimension of the outcome space is huge, right? And it's very difficult to say, well, this is the type of orchestration that always worked for this type of problem and use case. And then, in addition to that, you have the complexity of you dealing with LLMs that you don't control. And you go from 4.0 to 5.0, and all of a sudden, what was perfectly orchestrating and working stops working because the LLM started reasoning differently. But it's not your LLM. And so that introduces so many layers of risk. And my answer right now, because this is a moving target, when we talk to clients or when I lead my team is, well, this is an 80-20 type of approach, right? I don't think anytime soon we should be aiming at having full agentic systems dealing with, a whole claims function. And there is insurers out there, for instance, that are playing around with that. And for very specific type of risks, and I get it's a mixture of, RPA plus some agents, right, on the conversational side, they're actually able to deliver something that is almost fully agentic. But what we need is actually systems that accelerate the way we're doing things and always have humans for that 20%. Because it's very difficult. I really believe, and this is a bit controversial, right? But as long as LLMs and all of these systems that we're building for agents are based on transformer architecture, because of the way it is conceived, it will be very difficult for us to get rid of or minimize that risk. There's a component there that's just inherent to the way it is actually built and to the complexity of how it works, and to our, the lack of our ability as humans to understand those, vector spaces that have 512 dimensions and that, decompose meaning in ways that we can't start even understanding, and mapping, because it's so. That makes it a different game, and therefore we have to think about the risk in a different way.
It's moved to an area that, first of all, I have huge gratitude for you coming today.
No, thank you for having me.
When I met you at the InsurTech event through our mutual friend David Edwards, who is an absolute legend, an absolute gentleman.
And uses AI to chase away squirrels.
He uses AI to do everything. He's speccing me a gaming PC at the moment, but what you said is, and things may have changed, but I think it's coming to this point where we really need to analyse how we accept failure in machines, and how we accept the risk of failure in mechanised and machine systems. And we've kind of got to this point where what we're saying is there's no doubt there is commercial value in leveraging AI agents and agentic AI, but by the way they're operating in an almost human way, which is fantastic for human conversation, empathy, perceived empathy, customer experience, these sort of things. But there are potential areas that could present risk to a business.
Yes.
So the way it's deployed, project, guardrails, all of the good stuff, ethics, bias, which we can talk about, can be applied.
Yeah.
But also there's potentially a progressive way that we reconsider what we see as machine failure.
Yes.
Now, how does the insurance industry play it? Because I was reflecting, if every car was self-driving with a big common algorithm, cars would never crash into each other. So would you even need car insurance anymore? Well, of course, because there's random events, there's random things that occur. So we accept machine failure in vehicles as we bring this computational function to the human interface in businesses, in public services, health, this sort of thing. How do we insure against those risks of failure, and how do we perceive that?
I think there's probably two ways of looking at it. One is, as a society, and I think we discussed this back then, right? We get to tolerate machine failure in the same way we tolerate human failure, right? So we are a lot less tolerant towards a machine failure than we had to human error. There's human error and failure all the time. Sometimes you call somewhere and you get an agent that is in a bad mood or that doesn't find an answer, right? And so,
I know for a fact, and I'm not going to name the companies, but call centres that are outsourced have huge issues with turnover of staff. To the extent some have 100% turnover within a 12-month period. So if you're running a call centre handling customers, the failure rate is so high that you've got a turnover of 100%. So your training methods, your quality methods, we know that they are not brilliant at the moment.
Yeah, but how many times does that make headlines, Ian?
It doesn't.
So essentially, you call someone, you have a bad experience on the phone, and perhaps someone like me will take the time to sit down and write an email or fill in a survey, right? But usually, it's just a fact of life. You continue. If you have that type of experience with a machine, it makes headline. It's like, look what this AI did, right? Because we have less tolerance for machine failure. So I think part of the educational journey of interacting with AI will have to incorporate more tolerance for machine failure.
Fear? Do people fear the machines?
I don't know if it's fear or it's just the fact that we're not used to it. So this is not my story, but it's a story that, sometimes you hear on stage when you talk about that threshold that society needs to go, to cross to actually adopt a certain innovation. And one example that gets used sometimes is elevators, right? When elevators come across and all of these buildings were building the building with the elevator, there was a moment where they would say, you know what, I want to return the elevator. And obviously, from an architectural perspective and engineering perspective, it wasn't easy to return an elevator, right? And so what did Otis do back then? there was like 3 reasons. People started to get used to elevators. They were introduced consciously. The problem with elevators was people thought they were going to die in there. They didn't want to use the elevator, right? And so they did say, well, let's put some mirrors. We have them until today. Let's put some music. So people will be distracted with their own image. They will be soothed by classical music. But actually what was really interesting was they put in the person operating the elevator. Was it because operating the elevator was difficult? No. Everyone knows how to push a button, right? It was because people thought, okay, if it's this guy's job to be here for 8 hours, he doesn't die every day, so it's safe. And that's how people got used to elevators. And I think it's the same with AI, right? People now don't use Google anymore, or they don't use browsers anymore. And they got used to, well, half of this is probably not correct. It has hallucinated, right? Or I need to fact check this. Let me go to that link. How often do people go to links and sources when they read articles in the press? 0, right? But a lot of people, kids even, are now used to saying, oh, actually, I should check this. This doesn't sound correct. So that is the level of tolerance you have to generate in a society to go over that societal threshold of adopting a technology and getting used to its failure. So from an insurance perspective and risk perspective, if you want to be insuring a risk, you need to be able to price the risk, right? You need to be able to assess the loss that risk will bring. And we're very far from actually being able to do that across a number of, dimensions. So yes, obviously you can assess the loss if an agent fails and it generates an accident and it generates some physical loss, because that's easier to apprehend. The peril is different, but we know exactly how to calculate the loss. When it is more about things like reputational failure, and valuing a lot of intangibles, or understanding what litigation risks will arise from using AI, in interactions with customers in jurisdictions like the US, it's more difficult to actually assess that part of the risk. So, the insurance industry really has a responsibility towards society to determine how we transition into a world where that tolerance, generates less risk, as for instance, litigation risk. It has a responsibility to understand how we make sure that we're using AI in the right way. And if it's not used in the right way, you're not insured for its consequences. Because at the end of the day, the insurance industry for 300 years has been enabling the world to innovate and go into new areas. And that's what we're all about. That's what the industry is supposed to do. And so a lot of us are really investing into understanding the consequences of using AI. And it's really not straightforward. I come across a lot of people saying, oh, we're building, agentic systems. The way in which you map the possible outcomes is, even from a mathematical perspective, it's not a straightforward task. And the level of complexity of the interrelation of variables that can actually have an impact on that outcome dimension is huge.
I have only just recently learned about the exponential complexity of something called the 3-body problem, which is when you have, I think, if you're analyzing the universe and you look at universal objects on orbits, how they interact with each other and the gravitational forces interact with each other with 2 objects, we can just about mathematically model. When you bring a 3rd object or multiple objects in, we don't have anywhere near enough computational resource to analyze how those 3 bodies operate with different gravitational forces, distances, that sort of thing. And when I consider that, and I'm still trying to get my head around it really, but the 3-body problem looks a little bit like what the UK's AI assurance roadmap, they're actually talking about something called the multiplayer accountability problem, which plays to what you're saying. It's that when you start to bring in systems that have the risk or a trading loss is across so many variables that we can't even computationally analyze or predict, how do you even start to underwrite that level of complexity? Because you can't place accountability across so many different functions and actors.
Yes, and accountability is really key. And we had all of this discussion when we started thinking about autonomous cars, didn't we? And it was like, well, who is liable? Is it the company owning the algorithm? Is it the... But in a case of a complex system where the way in which the system will perform and deliver an outcome depends from the user itself. Was it my prompt that actually generated the mistake, or was it the way it was orchestrated? Where did it fail, right? And what generated the algorithm going into a certain direction? Was it the LLM provider? Was it the latest updates? Was it the new way in which it is encoding information? It's very difficult to assess who is responsible for an outcome when you have complex ecosystems of human agents, artificial agents, deterministic functions, systems, right, and software, and so we will have to find new ways of actually understanding that. So this is not a 3-body problem; it's a multiple body problem, right? And we could go into quantum and see when we're going to be able to actually compute that in the future. But even with computational power, the mathematical complexity of high-dimensional spaces is, we're not used to having. There's only a subset of people that have been in an area of knowledge that requires understanding that. And that's not necessarily, 90% of businesses out there. And so it is a fascinating area. I think there's so much to do right now because of the level of complexity.
Humanity, you've mentioned quantum. Let's just touch on that briefly.
Did you see the Caltech news was it last week or the week before?
Tell me about it.
So essentially, and I'm not an expert in quantum, right? But they were able, they generated, I think, 6,100 neutral qubits, right? And they did it at room temperature, Ian. So this is not somewhere, 0 Kelvin. And no, they did it at room temperature. And essentially the intuition is they were using laser beams, a network to actually hold these qubits together. And they were able to do it for 13 seconds, which doesn't seem a lot for normal people. But it's I think 10 times more than we used before.
I think that's like a lifetime or many lifetimes in the of an electron. Quantum, the potential is unbelievable.
Yeah.
And I've spoke to some Al Martin at IBM who leads the stuff globally. And in fact, IBM just announced something with HSBC where they've done algorithmic trading with quantum faster than traditional computing. Everything seems to be happening so quickly right now. And when I consider the idea of infinitely parallel computation to these type of problems like the 3-body problem and the multiplayer accountability problem, I believe that I genuinely believe humanity is on the verge of entering a whole new era of cognition and capability to understand more about our universe and ourselves.
Yes.
Which I find hugely exciting.
I say I believe there's a lot of things that can go wrong, but I believe a lot more on utopias than dystopias, right? And it is hugely exciting. And sometimes I think about, if you could start to extrapolate and avoid a Black Mirror type of scenarios, right? And you think, what if this leads to, no scarcity? What does it mean for society? What are we going to do with the time that is going to be unleashed with that extra productivity? What does it mean for our traditional economics models of looking at capital and labor, right? How do we think in terms of, we'll have agents and computers and automation? They don't consume, do they? So they're not consumers. And most of our growth is actually, yes, it's based on innovation and businesses, but it's actually based on consumers. So people around the world are the ones that are making economies grow, right? And that's a big argument against trickle-down economics. So essentially, we're in a world where consumers, they're not aware of their collective power, but they are driving growth. So what happens if those consumers now, are replaced in a lot of the things they do by some agents and productivity? And how do we manage the transition? Because those consumers will have to get to ways of, one, redefining their identity, finding their new place in society, but also having access to the value we're creating from a capital perspective so that they can continue consuming, right? And so it's fascinating from a societal perspective to understand what this will do to us and how we're going to redefine our roles and what impact this has on our identity. You ask people, who are you? And most people will answer what they do. And they're like, oh yeah, I'm an economist. I work at so-and-so. Rarely they will say things like, I'm the daughter of my parents, or I don't know, things that, or talk about their faith. Their identity, for a lot of people, identity is really part of what they do, and what they do defines them. And that will radically change. And it will have an impact on certain segments more than others, right? And we need, the transition risk of all of that is there. And the societal risk is a lot more, it's more urgent. The sense of urgency of those societal risks is higher than, say, a Terminator kind of scenario in the future. And so how, as societies, we actually transition and take people along that journey is critical. And it's critical because we will have to upskill them and reskill them, and people will have to unlearn. And I think everyone has that ability, right? I mean, we always talk about new generations and their phones, and how you look at the silver generation, and they actually are more active on a lot of our technology than the younger generations, right? And so we really need to think, okay, what does happen if, people don't need to work anymore? Let's go for a very far-fetched scenario. I'm not saying this is going to happen, right? But let's assume everything can be done by agents in the future. So, are people going to be playing games on their phone? How are they going to fill that? What are we going to do in society if we solve the scarcity problem? Or it's questions we should be asking ourselves, not because they're going to happen tomorrow or in 10 years, and they might never happen, but because thinking about those type of scenarios will enable us to understand how we manage to transition in a sustainable way as a society. And I think that's actually keeping me up at night, a lot more than super intelligence and machines taking over. I think, we're still far from a scenario of super intelligence and machines, taking over. I think we have all the tools, and we're thinking about that risk so much that it's not a zero chance, but it's a very, 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 very small chance of happening at this point. And then the other thing we were talking about was quantum has now accelerated, right? And yes, there was no entanglement in what they did, but they might get there. And if you think about, you don't need 6,100 qubits to, model and do calculations for as many atoms there's in the universe. You need 300. So 6,000 it's a significant number, right? What will that mean? That means that we will be able to actually solve problems that we never were able to solve before. What are we going to do with that knowledge? Where does that knowledge sit? Right? Geopolitical implications of it. So I do think we are at a moment in history where we're going to, there's going to be a significant shift, because we are going to unlock access to knowledge like we've never done before. And we really need to think about the implications of that, because, in the long term and in the aggregate, you can model that everything will end up being okay. But it's the journey there what's tricky. And it's the imbalances, and it's how it affects every individual what makes that journey complex. And the insurance industry has always been the industry that enables the world to take on risk, because 300 years ago, we had that fascinating idea that risk could be calculated and transferred to someone else, right? And so now people can engage in risky behavior because someone else is going to take that risk away from them. And we have to now assess, out of all of the risks related with technological convergence and this acceleration that we're feeling, which ones should be valued first, which ones are systemic, which ones need to be insured, which ones we need to govern. In the same way you tell someone, okay, you know what, you want to build a house on a volcano, you're not going to get home insurance. You shouldn't be building a house on a volcano. Well, as an industry, we need to be able to assess the risk and say, well, if this is the way you can build an agentic system, then you're not going to get insurance for it, right? Because the way of actually building it is this other way. But right now, we don't know what we don't know, right?
One thing, certainly in all the conversations I've had on Baseline, it's made me rethink how I think about entrepreneurship.
Yes.
If you think back to our opening discussion about decentralization and blockchain, that was very much trying to build a technology, and I tried to fit it existing problems of privacy and control and supply chain security. So you kept on hearing this noise, blockchain's a technology looking for a problem.
Yes.
Looking for a problem in the world in which we inhabit right now.
Yeah.
What I've learned, and I've learned it from a number of people I've spoke to on here, is we're moving into a very different world.
Yes.
And if you can model and calculate what that world's going to be, then you can calculate what that world needs and build for that. For example, low Earth orbit satellites, how we can fuse metals in space with no energy, and down here it costs a fortune to weld them. Well, if you can do that, we're going to start seeing manufacturing facilities in low Earth orbit.
Yes.
So a world where we have laboratories and manufacturing facilities, what does that need? Right now, so there's a whole set of opportunity to build for that new world. The one that you're talking about, which is essentially a level of human redundancy in the cognitive or physical world, that's going to require a whole new set of startups, companies, ideas, and innovation, which is hugely exciting. It's a huge opportunity.
And I don't like to use the word redundancy, right?
I did it deliberately to try and...
Because it does have a negative connotation.
That's what people are frightened of.
They are, right? And I like to think about, every time you're facing obsolescence, be it, from a point of view of what you do or the systems you have, right? It's a risk we all have in a world that's changing constantly. So instead of thinking about, redundancy risk, you have to think about, where am I adding value? What can I do that a machine will not be able to do or will not be able to do in the next 5 years or in the next 10 years? And then redesign the way you operate to make sure that the value you add as a human being, which we are still, a very complex operating system. And the level of complexity and decision-making and empathy and consciousness that we have is not going to be replicated by machines anytime soon, and perhaps ever. So we have to make sure that we understand where that is going. And we had this previous conversation about, my son wants to study philosophy, right? I think, it's critical that people study philosophy, that people study the way we think, that people study in which way we have to actually generate knowledge, because there is a component of that is very difficult to be replicated by machines. And so we have to think not about redundancy, but about what can we do that needs different skills and where do we bring in value? And that works at every level. It works at a personal and private level, but then as a company, I go out there and our clients in the insurance industry, we have a lot of conversations about target operating model. And so in the past, a lot of our companies have been built around technical functions, very siloed, very within a certain area, right? And now there is a level of convergence happening that already started with machine learning. And because we are now able to unlock data and liberate data we didn't have before, we have a level of timeliness and real-time integration into decision-making that enables multiple decision-making cycles to collaborate like they didn't do before. And so all of those cross-dependencies have generated or are generating target operating models that where technical functions and non-technical functions, in the specific case of an insurance company, are converging, right? And so the way in which we have processes, the way in which we used to do pricing and underwriting and claims and capital projections and capital modeling and reserving are changing, because now you can get inputs and outputs that are going into multiple directions in a way you couldn't before. And that changes the way you operate. And it might change the type of people you need, the amount of people you need, and certainly changes the type of software you need. And that applies to society in general. We can now use AI to actually redefine the processes. It's like you always have this, if an alien would come down to Earth, and look at how we live, they probably would ask, why are you doing this way? Or why don't you do this in this other way? Well, now we have like this tangible alien in here, right? AI can do a lot of that. And we cannot think in terms of the processes and problems we have, because there's a lot of things we don't see that some of these systems, because of the level of complexity they can handle, can see and will redesign in terms of processes, in terms of problems. And that is fascinating. And it begs the question of, where do we insert ourselves to add value so that this serves humanity, that this changes the world for the better, that this leads to less scarcity, and more wealth. And we have such a privilege to live in this moment of history where we can ask ourselves those questions. So I am an optimist. I've always been an optimist, right? But I think it is a fascinating moment. And the only thing that we cannot do is just ignore the risks, right? Being an optimist doesn't mean you ignore the downside. It's just you're very conscious of it, but you find ways to mitigate it. And I think that's how we should be thinking about technology right now.
I mean, one great thing is that AI is enabling people to do things they've never done before.
Yeah.
It's enabling whole new opportunities in areas. So many founders creating really interesting startups. What advice would you give to the AI founders, the AI startups, these small companies that are vibe coding, operating really quickly? Would you be saying assurance, insurability should be baked into their products from day one?
Yeah.
Or because my feeling is they could come up with a great algorithm or a great agentic function, but I believe they should be considering this insurability challenge now within their core foundational code and value.
Yes. So I think my advice would be, don't stop experimenting and finding out the art of the possible. And usually when you're finding the art of the possible, you loosen the constraints, right? Because the more constrained you are, the less you can achieve certain things. But once you've mapped out the art of the possible, you have to think how you constrain that back so that you minimize the risk. And what you see a lot, and I have a lot of respect for people, for entrepreneurs and people starting a startup. I've been mentoring startups for 15 years, and it's, a lot of them fail. And the level of respect, even sometimes when I come across a startup and I think, well, this idea is not going to fly for all of these reasons, and I give them those reasons, and then they think about it, and it's huge to just leave the comfort of another type of job and go for that, right? So I really have a lot of respect, but I think sometimes, because of the rules of the game, because of how venture capitalist works, because of the way in which you actually capitalize those startups, there is too much focus on the immediate outcome rather than on the sustainability of what you're doing. And I understand the pressure, right? Because, and then it's like Series A and B and C, and then you have multiple people that own your company, and you're not in charge of what you're doing anymore. And a lot of your long-term vision is becoming very short-termistic. And that's where the cracks occur, right? Because that's where you start cutting corners and you start not being aware of the risks of delivering the outcome in the way you're doing it. So that's always, what I tell people that are going into that space. Think about how you, finance your venture in a way where you retain as much control as you can, and don't sacrifice that long-term sustainability and resilience view that you need to have to survive for short-term outcomes. And then there's also, you get excited, right? You're doing things, and then all of a sudden you think that no one else does, and you think, okay, this is it. And rarely, when you're in that momentum of being excited and achieving things, you stop to think, it's like, oh, no, let's look at everything that can go wrong. And so I think that's the balance that actually those that make it, and startups that have been doing different things for 10 years, they were very consistent in never forgetting what that long-term view looked like, and how they built resilience by design into what they were doing. And a lot of the startups you see fail are the ones that just think, I'm going to deal with my lack of resilience, with all of these risks later, because now I have to show value. I think resilience is part of value, right? It's an intangible, but it needs to be there. And making it by design as opposed to I fix it later is is really critical to success in a lot of these cases.
When we talked about the challenges of humanity alongside AI, I do believe collaboration and cooperation face-to-face for humans is going to be so powerful.
Yeah.
Something that you can't get online. Indeed, you can't get online when you can't even tell whether the other thing is human or AI or somewhere in between.
And there is a level of chemistry that we'll never have with machines, because we are chemical beings. We are, animals from a chemistry and physical perspective. And sometimes that chemical connection, or soul connection, you can call it whatever you want, right? But it's a human to human connection that boosts communication and the way we solve problems in a way that you can't do that with machines, and you can't do that remotely also. So there's a lot of things that as humans we have and we can do that machines will never get there. And one of them is really, you put 5 people in a room and the energy and chemistry in that room changes, right? And if it's the right fit, it will lead to certain outcomes they could not imagine when you were looking at, these are the skills and this is how they think, because there's these additional elements that actually generate interaction and output. And so making sure that we leverage those is critical.
You've operated for a sustained time in this idea of risk transfer, where innovation technologies, how we transfer the risk of people leveraging and them using them. And you've been at the forefront of this for decades, enabling innovation to be deployed in business and public sector to improve people's lives, improve business outcomes, really move things on. Your ability to capture and comprehend highly complex technologies like quantum, AI, blockchain is something that I've never seen before. And AI is something that's moving so quickly. Yeah. Just what we talked about before the conversation. Today's a view, but we're dynamic in the way we're learning and understanding and applying that knowledge to be self-aware in the knowledge that we're going to change as we learn more and more. But Magda, let me ask you the question. Do you believe AI will take humanity to a utopia or dystopia?
I really want to believe it's going to be a utopia. I think the amount of wealth and well-being we could actually generate with systems that enable us to think differently, to change the way we produce. The upside, I see an upside that is far larger than the downside. So I want to believe it's going to be a utopia. We have to be very conscious of the risk, and we'll have to change the way we actually govern those risks. And, a lot can be regulation, but there's also a lot in how private sector nurtures this, and hopefully we'll be able to go beyond what usually traditionally drives, the private sector, and think about this from a holistical societal impact perspective. And that's why I love being in the insurance industry, right? Because that's inherent to who we are. We have always been about enabling societies to thrive together. We're based on mutualization principles, on sharing across society. And so, we have a mission to do that. And there's a lot of people that sometimes think, AI, it could be unethical, could be amplifier biases. Yes, that's true. And we have ways to mitigate that. But it's also true that it can actually help us understand our biases and understand our shortcomings in a way we didn't have before, right? And then you look at the model and you think, perhaps I was biased towards what my boss said or towards previous data. And this is not what the data is telling me, right? So we have biases as well, and unearthing them is something we can also do with technology. So we have to think about this in terms of what can be done now that we could not do 5 years ago, not do 10 years ago, and then build on that and not try to use this to replicate our current system just to be cheaper and faster. And I think that's what leads us to a utopia, as opposed to, a lot of very, very Black Mirror-ish outcomes that are there, right? And we need to be conscious of them and think about how to mitigate them or make them disappear.
We are in a computer game.